Day is auspicious because you're 2 days away from receiving the PPB Diamond Circle Award. So before we do our chat, what are your thoughts on receiving that award, and an award that, as we discussed off camera, many of your heroes have received?
Well, I looked up previous recipients, and I was stunned to see the names on there. I mean, some like Les Tremaine. We were just talking about the great Les Tremaine. Lorene Tuttle, member from radio, fabulous actress on radio. And then I ran into a name that impressed me more than any other, because when I was a kid growing up, I was such a fan of radio. And in a million years, I never would have guessed I'd be getting the same award as Fibber McGee got. And when I saw that, I thought, I have arrived. And they gave him the award, and also the writer of his show, Phil Leslie. And it was one of my favorite shows, still is. I mean, I go on YouTube and watch Fibber McGee, or listen to Fibber McGee shows, and terrific. But yeah, I'm very happy to get the Diamond Circle Award, but you have to be of a certain age and to be 75 again. But anyway, thank you for bringing that up.
Well, speaking of your age, born Robert L. Mills, what's the L stand for?
Lorimer, it's a family name, French, and I'm sorry now I didn't use it in my credits. I was listed as Robert L. Mills, but it's very trendy now for writers to use three names. I mean, you know, you get three names and it's classy. And it's longer on the crawl. So I'm glad I got Robert L. Mills there, but I always kind of looked back and thought I wish I had used Lorimer, because it's very different and would not be like anybody else. So, but that's where that comes from.
It has a certain panache.
Yes.
And your birth date?
1937. Oh, God. There was a real 1937. I know it's hard for you to imagine, but there were 30s before the 40s. And it was a great time producing wonderful people, because we all came up through a certain era, and it was the end of vaudeville, and radio was big when we were growing up, so we were all familiar with it, those born in those years. And then television came along and used a lot of the people that we had come to know in radio. And it was an interesting time to grow up. And the world changed immensely, obviously, but it was a more innocent time back then, when I think of Fibber McGee shows and shows like that, Jack Benny program. You were going to ask me what my favorite show was, or what the first show I remember ever hearing on the radio, and I think it was the Jack Benny program, because it was exactly the same, opened exactly the same way every week, and they had such strong characters, you know, that carried from one week to the next, and you came to know them like members of your own family. And it was your own imagination, too, that came into play with radio. It's hard to describe it to people who aren't familiar with listening to radio, but you imagine what these people looked like. And when sometimes you would listen to someone on the radio for years, and you would finally see a picture of the person, and it wasn't matching what you had in your head, and you'd be like, what? I mean, you couldn't believe it. But that's how close radio actors became to us. And I was interested in writing, so I knew the names of all radio writers in those days. And the Jack Benny program, they would call out the names of the writers. And so it became familiar to the listeners. And so it was a thrill when I got to join some of them and work with some of those writers later that I had listened to on the radio.
Born in San Francisco, San Francisco proper or a suburb?
Yeah, in the city itself, out by the beach.
What was you had siblings, you said. Do you think you took more of an interest in radio and listening than they did?
Yeah, I think I did. I had a brother, and I think I had a kind of an odd liking for radio, show business in general, movies, and I think you're just born with that. You're interested in it or you're not. I was always interested more in how things were done than what I saw on the screen. How they do that? how is it done? Like we're here now, and this interests me how we're doing this, and people are going to watch me, and all this equipment and lights and everything, and that's what growing up I was interested in, the background of it, the how-to. That makes you a little odd, but I was odd. Still am.
You specifically, you said a moment ago, you thought about writing and were interested in the names of the writers in a way that not everyone is who listens to radio or sees television or reads books for that matter. When you first took an interest in writing, did you specifically think in terms of I want to be a writer for broadcast as opposed to I want to be maybe a novelist or...
No, I never thought of being a writer at all. I just went to school, and writing was stressed. I had a Catholic school, and you would write essays from the time you were in grammar school, and they stressed the importance of writing because if you can't communicate anything to others, no matter what you become an expert in, you're not going to be able to rise to the top. So you have to be able to write. And luckily, they taught me well, and so I was always a good writer, but I never thought of doing it for a living. I mean, really. Until much later, like in my 40s.
You have described yourself in your book and elsewhere as a class clown.
Yeah.
And you say, I believe it's in your book, you refer to a class clown as someone who is a nanosecond ahead of life. In fact, you talk about writing comedy as someone who is a nanosecond ahead of life. What did you mean by that? And give us a sense of...
Well, I think they always ask me, were you a class clown? Yes. And class clowns are simply people who have learned the enjoyment of making a whole group of people laugh at the same time. I mean, you can make friends laugh one at a time, and that's one thing. But to make a whole audience laugh, there's something to that. And the first audience you're in contact with is your classmates, the whole class. So you would say something and get them to laugh. It was a wonderful thing to me anyway. I just got a terrific charge out of hearing that laughter. Laughter's a great thing, it really is. And I love to laugh myself. And so you're always thinking that nanosecond ahead. In other words, it sounds very spontaneous comedy, but most of it is, there's some planning involved. You have to anticipate that the nun is going to do a certain thing, and when she does that certain thing, you are going to make some sort of smart-ass comment on it, and it's going to strike the class as funny, and they're going to laugh. And that's what class clowns do. It's improv, but improv with some planning, some pre-planning. You get to know what nuns do anyway, and constantly making comedy from what the teacher is doing is surefire because the class is ready to laugh at that, right? And you would think you would make enemies of the teachers. Just the opposite. They, in effect, become little minor stars because they're getting laughs. And you learn when you do class clowning in the proper way where the line is and you don't cross over. I mean, you're not going to get kicked out of the class. You're going to ingratiate yourself to the nuns, which I did. And, it was a great thing because I was like a little performer. But I never thought of doing it for a living. Isn't that funny? I mean, there were people doing it for a living, but it just never occurred to me that I would do something like that for a living. So I just went the ordinary way, went to college, went to law school, became a lawyer, and there's always something missing, Never enjoyed practicing law. Got into show business in the first 5 minutes. I had more fun than I had in the previous 10 years practicing law. I thought, this is where it's at, And when you're doing something that you really enjoy doing, it's not a job anymore. It's like your hobby. They asked George Burns when he was going to retire. Remember George Burns? He was a very big star at one time, folks, but lived to be 100. And he said, I retired the day I entered show business. And he wasn't kidding. And people laugh and yeah. But he wasn't kidding. I know the feeling that you never work again because, and in fact, you get guilt feelings that you're getting all this stuff from putting words on paper or standing up on a stage, making the whole country laugh. Uh, he lived in Beverly Hills and used to say it just staggered his imagination. This little kid that went to the third grade could live in Beverly Hills and from doing what he did and having so much fun doing it. But that's the key, and I think it helps people live a long time, because if you're doing something that you don't like, it eats you up from inside out. And law would have done that. I don't think I'd be here if I kept practicing law. I didn't like it.
Bob Hope comes into your life in an interesting way because, as you reveal in your book, you wrote your first gag for Bob Hope, who would later be your employer for many years. You wrote that first gag for Bob Hope while you were in high school. Give us a sense, first of all, of your knowledge of Bob Hope as a fan, when he came into your life as a fan, and then later that first gag when you wrote a gag.
Well, Bob Hope was on the radio, so every week, and so he became somebody that you were very familiar with, along with Jack Benny and Phil Harris, Alice Faye, the whole gang of them, very familiar to you. So then whenever you had a chance to actually see them in person, it was a thrill, see? So he was on a book tour. He came to San Francisco. He was promoting his book, Have Tux, Will Travel. And so I said to a friend of mine, we were in grammar school at the time, I think 7th grade, 8th grade, like that. And so I said, let's take the day off. I could get a day off from the nun because I made a star out of her, see. So we got the day off and we went down to the Emporium. He came to this big department store and he had a book signing little area there set up, and he was selling the books. I never intended to buy a book. I didn't have any money. I was just a kid. But I had a little paperback copy of Bing Crosby's book called Going My Way, or I forget the name of it. But anyway, he had written this book before Bob did. So I thought, I'll hand Bob this book and ask him to sign it for me and see what his reaction is, knowing that they have this little comedic, they're doing the road pictures and stuff. So we go down there. I get in line. I get up to finally talk to him, and I hand him the book. Now I said, I can't afford, I'm just a kid, Bob. I can't afford your book. I don't have any money. I don't have a job. I'm in grammar school. But I just wondered if you'd sign this. So I hand it to him. Now he takes the book. He turns it, shows the, Call Me Lucky it was called, opens the book and shows it to the crowd there. This is how quick he was. He knew he had a comedy bit here. And he took the bait just like I thought he would. And he shows the crowd, and then he says, here's what I think of this. And he tosses it straight up in the air, and it flies up, and I go scampering after it, right? The audience screams. They're laughing, and I'm thinking, as I'm catching it, I remember it landed way over in another department, homewares, I think. I'm next to a vacuum cleaner. And I'm looking now at the group pretty far away, and I thought, God, it worked. And I got a big laugh. I didn't get his autograph even. He didn't even sign the book. But he got a laugh out of that, and he gave one to me because I gave him the opening, see. So it was just fun, and we went home, right? And it made a good story, and I told people about it. And then 40 years later, almost to the day, he hires me, and I'm thinking, wow, that's life, you know. Strange things can happen. Who would have imagined in the interim between that time that he threw that book in the air, I had gone to college. I mean, I'd gone in the Navy first, and then went to college, and 4 years of college, 3 years of law school, 10 years of practicing law, and then I meet him and become a writer for him, and wrote for him for close to 20 years. And I'm thinking the first joke I wrote for him, and it was a visual, and I didn't know I was consciously doing that, but that's what I was doing, and it worked. And because I knew his character, I knew he would do something. I didn't know he'd do that, right? But I knew he would say something. I knew he would react in some way to make the crowd laugh, because he's in the laugh-making business. And you know that going in. So there's no danger, and he's not going to take offense. And he's going to know that I'm ribbing him, because that's what he did. And I realized right after I met him that we were from the same cloth. He had been a smart ass too. And I simplify things sometimes, and I say gag writers, especially like Bob Hope writers and people who wrote gags for stand-up comedians like that, really have just learned to think of smart-ass things like they've been doing all their life, writing them down and getting money for them. And it's as simple as that. I have a little 1-minute comedy thing online, that's a comedy lesson, 1-minute comedy lesson. But in essence, that's it, isn't it? I mean, let's not complicate things. There's a little more to it, but the basic thing is there. That's what you're doing. You are just developing some kind of a little knack. Woody Allen said, I mean, they would interview Woody Allen, and he was my mentor, by the way. I mean, when I started to sniff around doing this for a living, I was imitating what Woody had done, because Woody started sending gag lines to Walter Winchell, the columnist growing up. And to this day, Woody says his biggest thrill is seeing his name for the first time in Walter Winchell's column, having written a line. And he was like 15 at the time. And then that's how he got started. And that's how we all got started, by writing one-liners like that. And he said that you can't really describe the ability to do that. You acquire it somehow. It appeals to you to think that way, so you think that way. He gives an example. He said, I would sit in school, and next to me would be a girl drawing a picture of a rabbit, and it looked beautiful. I mean, it looked like a rabbit. He said, I try to draw a picture of a rabbit, and I get a stick figure that looks like, a horse. Two separate things. She just was born with the ability to draw the rabbit. I'm born with the ability to think like Woody Allen thinks. And he's taken it quite a ways. Done quite well with it. But he started out as a gag writer, and wrote for a lot of shows and TV things when he first started. Got a TV show, by the way, I just read in Time Magazine. Coming back. It's did you read anything about it?
Yeah.
What's it called?
Amazon.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And now somebody interviewed him. He says, the worst mistake I ever made. He's saying he's sorry he did it, but we'll wait to see if we agree with them. But I think probably it'll be fine. But terrific insecurities that Woody Allen has, that's just built in. And oh God, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done this, But I got to see him once doing stand-up, and I still remember it, just clear. He was something else, and he had a spot in his act where he'd take out a watch, and he says, very close to this watch. It was sold to me by my grandfather on his deathbed. And he puts the watch away. So he gets a laugh on that. Later I read where that was a ploy to see where he was in the act. And he had so structured the act that he knew he should be like 49 minutes in when he looks at that watch. If he's 48 minutes in, he's going slow. If he's 52 minutes in, he's a little fast, so slow down. And he would adjust his act. This is how clever the guy is, To use a joke like that, and little did we know, he's checking to see how he's doing, time-wise. Wonderful guy, but we're off the topic. What's the next question?
You entered the law, as you said, instead of doing something that you wanted to do. Why? You said you described it in the interview a moment ago as I did the normal thing and I went into law, which is hardly the normal thing for most people because it does require a rather rigorous education. Why do you think you went into law?
Well, because I could write. And if you can write, it's a big advantage. You can, whatever you're learning, whatever subject you're talking about, you write articles, right? We have an article writer, he knows what I'm talking about. The ability to do that is a terrific advantage because in the exams you're communicating what you know in such a way that it appears more than it really is. You know what I mean? So I was no genius, that's for sure, but I could write well, and they very often say you write well. So I was getting encouragement, but not enough to think about, hey, I should write well enough to build a house somewhere. I never thought that way. But by normal course, I mean, in San Francisco, that's what you did. People from my strata, if you went to college, and then if you showed any abilities toward academia, you continue to something else. So I got to the end of 4 years of college, and I thought, what do I do next? So a friend of mine, had enrolled in law school already, night classes. He said, come on over and sit in a few classes, see what you think. So I went, USF, and I liked the classes, and I loved the education I got as a lawyer. It's a fabulous education. I would recommend it to anybody because it helps you think and figure out how life works, and it's a terrific thing to know the law. But to practice it and have people in trouble coming to you, not my cup of tea. So that's how that happened. And I didn't know at the time that I was writing and taking advantage of the fact that I knew how to write. But would be 10 years later that just pure luck would have me write some jokes for a local disc jockey in San Francisco, and one thing led to the next, and now I have a swimming pool and house.
Well, that DJ is San Francisco disc jockey Don Sherwood, and this is the beginning of your entree, not professionally at first, but your entree into the world of the media. Give us a sense of how you got involved with Don Sherwood and how that evolves into actually leaving the law and getting involved in showbiz.
I'd listened to Sherwood as a high school kid, and I went into the Navy after high school and before I went to college and everything. And so this was after college, and I'm still living in San Francisco, and I'm practicing law in Palo Alto. We moved to Palo Alto. I was married to Shelley then, got married late. I was married about 34 years old. And so I hadn't been married too long. And Sherwood had retired. Then he came back on the air, big station in San Francisco called KSFO. And he wasn't as funny as I had remembered growing up. And I thought, he needs some material. So I sit down, and I can still remember clearly typing on a big IBM Selectric with the ball that would spin around, And I typed these jokes and just mailed them off and thought, well, if he likes them, great. If he doesn't, it's just the cost of a stamp. And it was the company anyway, the law firm. So put it in with the rest of the mail. The next day or the day after, he was on in the morning. I'm driving into work, and he said, I got these terrific jokes from this lawyer in Palo Alto. I thought, wow. And it went from there. It got to the point he was doing everything that I sent him and giving me credit on the air, which at the time was more valuable than paying me money because it got me thinking about, hey, I'm good at something, So anyway, where was I? Bring me up to date.
Just Don Sherwood.
Writing for Don Sherwood with the IBM Selectric,
Yeah, so
or the Wheelwriter.
I keep sending him material, and he keeps doing it on the air and giving me credit by name. Now, judges are asking me in court, is that you that Don Sherwood is quoting every morning? And I say, yes, Your Honor. Funny stuff, funny stuff. So everybody was enjoying it. It got to be kind of like a little joke around Santa Clara County where Palo Alto's situated. And the more I sent, the more I used, so the more complex my submissions would become. So gradually, I got to the point where I was doing little scripts. He had a kind of a sidekick named Aaron Edwards, and they would joke back and forth. And I thought, I'll do a little called Letters to Uncle Don, and I would make up letters from distraught listeners, and then Aaron would read the letter, Don would do the funny retort, all written down. And they just loved it. They made a big production out of it. They put organ music, and now it's time for Letters to Uncle Don, where I look back on it, and it was so ridiculous at the time, but it was so much fun and then to listen to this stuff coming back over the air and knowing that all these other people are listening at the same time to radio, which you know how much I enjoyed that listening all those years. It was just a surreal time for me. And finally he called Shelley and me in and said, I want you to come up to the station was at the Fairmont Hotel. He said, come up after my show. I want to talk to you. So we came up and we had breakfast with him in the restaurant there. And he said, you are really a piece of work when it comes to, he says, I've had writers before and I know the business and you should be doing this for a living and you have the talent to do this. Well, coming from him, it was just worth its weight in gold because I respected him and he was a giant and he knew comedy and he knew the business. And for him to say that to me, dangerous because now I've got somebody who is telling me I can do something else. Now I start to think. So now another lucky thing happens, and I am reading an article in Writer's Digest magazine by Jean Carroll, who became my mentor. And Carroll says, if you want to get into professional comedy writing, write for local people like Toastmasters, anybody who needs speeches, but do it, because that's how you learn to do it. And then you hear how your material plays, and you develop the ability to write funny lines for other people or for yourself if you want to do stand-up. Well, I never wanted to perform, so I thought, I'm already doing this. I'm sending to Sherwood. So I send off all this stuff to Gene when I see his name go by on the credits of the Cal Burnett show. I said to Shell, that's the guy who wrote the magazine article. I'm going to send him. So I did. Well, that's all she wrote. I mean, he was on the phone in a flash, said, this is great stuff. You should be down here. I'm thinking, what is this? I mean, you have to admit, that's a strange thing, the way things happen. But he said to me, he said, you just have an ear for this stuff. And so then he started to give me assignments to see if I could work on order, on demand, because that's what professional writing is. It's not waiting around until inspiration hits you. It's getting into the chair and start typing something by a deadline. So he would give me these deadlines, and they were Bob Hope monologues. And he was writing Bob Hope monologues on the side while he's working on the Cal Burnett show, doing the sketches and everything with his partner, Billy Richmond. And later I met all these people, and Gene had me come down. But at that time, I'm getting this invaluable experience doing work on order and writing for now a big star. And of course, I had developed an ear for Bob Hope and what he did at the beginning of the show. So it was like second nature by this time. And I'm getting a lot on the show. He's putting these lines in with his stuff, and it's going in. And he was paying me by then, I think, something. I forget how much it was, but that didn't matter. What mattered was it was a testing a thing that let me know that I could do this before I make a drastic change and pull up stakes and sell my house and move down here to Burbank, which is exactly what we did, based on pretty much that, I got a lot of encouragement. And it was a strange time, but, and Shelley's family would say, "You're going to do what?" They just couldn't believe this. See, we were living in Los Gatos, and it became later Silicon Valley, and very expensive area up there now. But we took a flyer to do it because Shell knew that I didn't like practicing law, and I needed to do something else, and it looked as good as anything. So that's how I got started as in professional. And then it was a while before I would be sending material around and stuff, and we were living off of what we had sold our house. We had that, real estate prices going up in California all the time, and it was it gave me a chance to come down and to be here, because Jean always said, if you really want to work in this town, you have to live here. So we decided to take a flyer and do it, and the risk paid off, because it wasn't too long before I got my first job on the Dinah Shore show. Same way through Jean. In fact, Jean was called by a producer who wanted material, and Jean says, "Well, I'm busy, but I know someone who's perfect for it." So he recommended me, and I got to work on the Dinah Shore show. Now, that was perfect because Shell had to, I was living in a motel. Shell had to go back up and sell our house and do all the paperwork. And I'm down here writing for the Dinah Shore show. But she was doing 90-minute tapings. She taped all of her shows at one time and then would spread them out. She loved to play golf, so it was great training for me because I'd never been on a set before professionally. Now I had a pass with my picture on it, and I walk into CBS, and it's just unreal. I'm looking around, and by observing, I learned what all the functions were of cameramen, producers, showrunners, and how it worked. They have a meeting and they talk over things, and then also how to handle celebrities. She had a lot of celebrities, and you'd have to pre-interview them. And I just off the boat, right? So I'm watching the other guys and how they do it, and so I kind of took to it and learned how to do the pre-interview, and then you would write little spots for some of the guests, and just great experience for me. And then from there, I got hired onto the Dean Martin Roasts, and that was another good training show for me because it was all comedy. And I had a partner, and Harry Crane hired me on that show, a legendary head writer for Dean Martin. And we would go up and shoot the show in Las Vegas, and those were great times because all the writers went up and participated in the rehearsals and everything, and all these stars. Again, we taped all those shows in one weekend because Dean didn't like to work too much either. So we do 3 shows on Saturday and 3 on Sunday. So we had all these guests in Las Vegas for that weekend on all of these shows, and they're all over the place. And people say, "God, this Las Vegas is great. Every other person's a celebrity." But that was great training for me because you go from writing for Orson Welles one day, and the next day you're writing for Zsa Zsa Gabor. Well, they don't speak the same way, and you're really learning how to get into the idiom of how they speak, And that's the key, too. Writing for other people, you develop an ear for getting into their head and what would they say if they thought cleverly like you do, and make it sound like they're thinking of it as they go along. And if you're doing it well, people don't think there are writers involved at all. I've had people say to me, "You mean that stuff is written?" I'd say, "Oh, you have no idea. That's what we do. And we do it well if you think it's not written." So it's fun.
Well, you've covered a lot of material here, but let's hit a couple of points in here that are.
I have to, because you got 100 questions.
Not necessarily. I've got 100 possible
Yeah.
questions. Gene Parrott does something very interesting for you that, frankly, I've never heard of anyone else doing in the business at all, which is
Or in life.
he actually puts your name on his work to help you get a job at a time when you were in a very unique situation. Tell us that story.
Well, when we first were in town, we were looking for a house, and we didn't want to call Gene, who lived in San Marino, because we didn't want to impose on him, thinking, oh, you know, he was working on Carol Burnett at the time. So I said, let's not tell Gene that we're here, that we're even in town. So we don't. But he gets the call for the Dinah Shore show, and Carolyn Raskin was the producer, and says, well, have him get his material over to Dinah. She's heading to Las Vegas on Friday or whatever it was, tomorrow, and by 10 o'clock, say. And so Gene said, I'll call him and have him do that. So he calls my house in Los Gatos, and the real estate guy is there and says, oh, Bob isn't home. He's in Los Angeles house hunting. What? Oh, good. So now Gene doesn't want to lose the opportunity, which he knows I'll be perfect for, but I'm just not quite available yet. So we had been writing the same scripts anyway, so our styles are the same. So he puts my name on his Dinah jokes and sends them over. So another day goes by, still no, and he's expecting me to call him sometime and tell me the news, but I don't call him. So we don't call the real estate guy. We don't put the pressure on him either. So we're blasely looking around in Burbank. And so the second day comes, and Dinah loved the first joke so much. She wants more, and he's got a job. Well, he can't make it quite yet, but he's on his way. But I'll call him, and we'll get the second batch of jokes over to you, which he does. He does it again to save me. Finally, we call the house in Los Gatos, and the real estate guy says, call Gene Perry, you've been trying to get you for 2 days. What? So I called Gene. He says, oh, God, get over to CBS. You've got a job. I said, really? He said, yeah, I've been covering for you for 2 days. You've done 2 assignments. I said, was I funny? Oh, boy. So now I walk into Dinah. I haven't written a word for her, but she thinks I have. And nobody ever knew that story until later when I told it. And it is just remarkable that someone would do that for a fellow human being. But I knew he was a nice guy when I read the magazine article he'd written in the first place. I'm reading the article, I'm thinking, why would a guy in Hollywood write an article telling someone to come to Hollywood who very well may threaten the writer's job? And I asked Gene about that later. And he said, well, you've been here long enough now to know that there's nobody who writes like us. I have no fear. I mean, if you fear that somebody is going to take your job away, you're not very good, you know? And so that's the way he was, and that's the way he is. And just a wonderful, he's written a lot of books, by the way, for fledgling writers, for Writer's Digest books. And 4 or 5 about how to get started, how to do stand-up comedy, how to inject humor into business speeches, that kind of thing, you know. Just very, very instructional type stuff that he wants to pass on to other people. And that's a great, great thing to do for him. And just lucky that I stumble on to somebody that nice, or, you know, he'd be working for Dinah and I wouldn't. But he saved that job. And then later on, I called about the Dean Martin roast too. He said, I heard that they're looking for writers, and I think you'd be perfect for it. Call Harry Crane over at the Dean Martin office, which I did. And Crane was very, he said, it's very simple to come to work for Dean Martin. I'm going to give you the assignment. I'll give you the topics. You write up the jokes. Bring them over to me. If I like them, you got the job. So I thought, oh, wow. Because by this time, monologue writing is second nature to me. I've been doing it a while. So he picks a few things out of the news at the time. And I said, when do I deliver these? Oh, by 2 o'clock tomorrow. I thought, oh, 2 o'clock tomorrow. It's an eternity. I could have delivered them in like 2 hours, but he's going to give me a whole rest of the afternoon plus the night until 2 o'clock the next day to write these, 10 pages of jokes. Come on. So I have a lot of time, and I write 10 pages of jokes. So I go and knock on his door. He brings me in, and he was such a character. He says, "Oh, Bob, yeah, come in. What do you got?" So I hand him the thing. He sits behind a desk, and he reads the jokes, page by page, and not a reaction, not one, nothing. Doesn't smile, he doesn't frown, he doesn't do anything. He's just reading the jokes. And he gets to the end, and he holds the stack of papers up, about 10 pages of jokes, and I get up to grab them, and he had taken the paper clip off on purpose. And as he's handing me the sheets of paper, he lets go a nanosecond early, so they go on the floor. Now I'm scrambling around on the floor, gathering up the jokes, and he says, "You have some nice things here. When can you start?" So that was how the Dean Martin roast started. And then he was so nice to my partner and I, the guy that I had met on Dinah Shore, because they only hired teams for Dean Martin roast, so I needed to find a guy I could write with, and I'd done some things with Mel Chase, so we partnered. And so when we first started, he said, "You guys are great line writers, but I'll be happy to stay after work and go over routining for the Martin show if you want." Wow, willing to do that, which he did. He would stay after work because we were on a, I think, 3-week, 4-week trial period, and we had to survive that 4 weeks. And he just helped us immensely. Wonderful guy. I really miss him, and a character. A lot of stories about Harry Crane. But that's how that happened. Another, just a lucky thing, and all these shows came at just the right time for me. The Dinah show, I learned all the technical stuff. Dean Martin show, I learned how to deal with stars, and because we wrote all the spots for everybody, and you're dealing with a lot of celebrities. And so by the time I was hired off of Dean Martin roast, I went over to talk to Hope, and he said, "When can you start?" And I said, "I still have about 6 weeks on my Dean Martin contract." He turns to Elliot Kozak, his manager, and says, "He can start right away. He can work it on the evenings. Sign him up right away." So now I go home and I say to Shell, "We now work for 2 major stars." Who? Bob Hope and Dean Martin at the same time. Isn't that remarkable? I mean, I go from sending a few jokes to Don Sherwood. I'm working for Dean Martin and Bob Hope at the same time. So we're pinching ourselves. It's a story, but I'm sticking to it.
It is almost a cliche at this point that Dean Martin didn't like to rehearse. And you said to me once off camera that you never met Dean Martin in all the time you wrote for him. So I think that kind of reinforces the cliche of Dean Martin that even his comedy writers don't interact with him. Give us a sense of what it was like to write for Dean Martin.
Well, I wrote the roast, so the only thing Dean Martin did on the roast was the interaction with the stars. You would write that, and then you would write a monologue for Dean at the beginning. But he had become, the only reason he was doing the roast was he wanted to stop doing television because he was really a good golfer, and he loved to play golf. He and Perry Como, apparently being Italian singers, they just loved to play golf. So Dean would rather play golf every day, which he would do. So Greg Garrison, who had been his producer-director on the old Dean Martin variety show, when Dean said, "I don't want to sign again, Pally, I'm tired of the variety show," that's the way he talked, And he says, "If you can find something simple for me, okay." So it was Greg Garrison who came up with the idea of doing a takeoff on the old Friars Club roast. They had been doing those for years. So we'll do them with celebrities, and we'll get some big hotel in Vegas to back us, and it'll be cheap because they'll pay for a lot of stuff. And he was really a sharp cookie, and he was so sharp. He used to come in and say to us, "Make sure you don't refer to any presidents or anything like that, or products or anything that will date this stuff, because I want these things to play for years." Well, I look at it, television now. I mean, I can watch a Dean Martin roast. It's like it was shot yesterday, and everybody's dead on it, including Dean Martin. I mean, there's nobody left, and yet you don't have a clue that they're all gone. It's fresh and bright, and the material holds up. See, so anyway, he goes along with this idea of doing the roast, and he said, "I don't want." He was so quick. He was very smart, Dean Martin, not book learning, but street smarts. He could memorize stuff. And on the variety show, he never used to like to rehearse. So Garrison would play him in all the sketches. They would tape him, and then they would show Dean Martin this 5 minutes before he's going to go out and do it. And he would watch Garrison do it, and then he'd go out and do the same thing and memorize the lines and everything like that. Oh, he's just a sharp cookie, see? And so when he was doing the roast, he never came over to we used to ride him across the street from NBC. And all the guests would come there, but never Dean. They'd never see Dean, you know. And he would come in that weekend that he was going to tape these shows, and Harry Crane would take the monologue up to him. He'd go through the jokes. Yeah, take that one out. Fine, okay, let's do it. And he'd come down, and when he ended the show, we'd tape 3 in a row. At the end of the third show, as the band is playing, da-da-da-da-da, "Good night, everybody," and he walks off, they'd have a door open and a limo with the engine running. He'd jump in the limo, and he would be back home almost before the theme faded. That's how quick he wanted to get out of Las Vegas, because this was years after the old Rat Pack days. And Dean was a family guy. He loved his family, even in the Rat Pack days. We used to talk to Sammy Davis, and Sammy would say, "Boy, Dean had the image of being the party guy and everything, but he wanted to go home early." It was Sinatra who wanted to stay up. He was an insomniac, alcoholic, etc., and would keep these guys up until all hours. But Dean would take off, and was never a drunk, ever. But great act. And, you know, you thought he was drinking a little bit, at least, but no, he... And then I met him the first time as a guest on the Bob Hope special. So I went up to him at rehearsal. I said, "Dean, I want to thank you." "Hey, Pally, how are you?" I said, "You don't remember me, but I just want to thank you." "Well, thank me for what?" I said, "Oh, my house, got a couple of cars, I got some nice dogs, got a nice life." "What are you talking about?" I said, "I wrote on the roast." "Oh, no, wasn't that, there was a lot of fun, Pally, with Harry, and we reminisced, you know, and it was then, you know, history. But he was a nice man, very, very nice, and I'm sorry I didn't get to know him a little better. And then he lost his son in that jet accident. He was a National Guard pilot, and he got killed. And Dean never recovered, and he died sad, and it was a sad thing to see that. But Dean was one talented piece of work, I'll tell you.
2 questions about that before we move on to Bob Hope. One is, you mentioned Mel Chase, and you said the Dean Martin roasts only hired comedy teams. In those days, not just the roasts, but the business was such that many of the shows only hired comedy teams. It was simply the way things were a lot in those days. So as you've noted, you had to find a partner. How did you feel about the fact that you had been writing successfully by yourself, and now you, just because of the way the business was structured, you pretty much had to take a partner? Did you feel good about that or bad about that?
Well, it was different from sitcom writers are usually teams, because one guy's a story guy and the other guy's the jokes, and it works out. What we were both line writers, or gagsters, you know, gag writers. And so that's what Harry taught us on the roast, how to routine and how to make an exchange back and forth, and a little more sitcom-y type of stuff. But so it didn't bother me at all, because, you know, I'm primarily a line writer. And then when I went to work for Bob Hope, he had always employed individuals and teams. He was never partial to one or the other. And he was strange because he didn't want us to collaborate. He wanted everybody to turn in an assignment. If you were an individual, it's your assignment. If you're a team, it's their assignment. But he doesn't want bleeding over and interaction, because he wanted the approach of all of the writers to everyone, has a different idea of how a sketch should be written and writes their version. Although we're all writing the same sketch from the same outline, he's getting all these versions. Well, it's a very expensive way to work, because you don't allocate work on the show. Everybody's writing everything on the show, which is the way Bob Hope radio shows were. And in those days, not only would they have to write the whole show, start to finish, every writer on the show and team, but stand up and perform it in a room with one of the other writers. Oh, wow. I mean, you can imagine how careful you are to put your best stuff on that paper if you're going to have to get up and sell it amongst your peers who are very critical, right? And so Hope used that competition to great advantage. It was very expensive, but he used it to great advantage. Now, he had to sew together all this material. He had tons of stuff. He might have 6 or 8 versions of a sketch, the same sketch. He's got to find the lines that he likes in each one and put it together somehow. He used to do it on his bed and spend hours doing it, but he loved it. He loved editing, and that's the way he worked. He was the only guy who worked that way, for sure. So in answer to your question, no, it didn't bother me to have to write with somebody else, because it didn't really change much.
One last thing on the topic of Dean. I think when we talked off camera at one point talking about Dinah Shore, you had said, I think, that you were not WGA members on the Dinah Shore staff, if I recall correctly. You might have been editorial staff.
Yeah, the first time we were admitted to the WGA was Dean Martin Rose.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
So you became a WGA member as a result of work on Dean Martin.
Yeah, in fact, on those talk shows, to this day, you're called a talent coordinator. You're not called a writer, or they'd have to pay you WGA. So that's how they get around that. But you're writing. And a lot of these reality shows, are written. But they're reality shows, supposedly, so the people who are writing this stuff are not writers and not subject to minimum requirements. And the business has been ruined because of it, really. It's lousy.
There were and are a number of
But I'm not
other titles
bitter.
that could be given,
Yeah.
such as editorial staff. It is on the heels of this that Bob Hope comes into your life in a meaningful way as your employer. You said in your book, as soon as I met him, I knew he was going to hire me. How did you become involved with Bob Hope?
Well, through Gene Parrott. And see, I had already been writing for him. And Gene recommended me and then showed him material that I had written. And of course, Gene had paved the way, so that there's no way he's not going to hire me. I've been already... Now, Hope never knew that I had gone back as far as I had with Gene. And he held my hand from the beginning when I first started. But no, I could be tested first and know that I'm going to do the job very well, because I've been doing it very well for a while, right? Only now I'm going to get real money for it. And, right, it was terrific to get a job that way, because you're very confident. In fact, one of the first assignments I got, I went to work for Bob Hope in July 1977. In August, Bing Crosby dropped dead on a golf course in Spain. So Hope calls the writers, and he says, I can't even think. It really hit him hard, because his own mortality he hadn't thought about, right? And now he loses Bing. So he says, see if you guys can come up with something. The reporters are after me, and I can't think straight. And so I'll be in. He was flying back from New York. He canceled the show, first show he canceled in years, and God, of all people, Bill Cosby to sub for him. But I got to work on it, and I thought, well, I'll use the same system that I use for the jokes. I'll do a setup, and then I'll do a strong payoff to the setup. It won't be a joke, it won't be a laugh line, but it'll be written that way. And so I did that, and I wrote some eulogy things for Bing. Ran him over. I was living in a condo almost within walking distance of Hope's house in Toluca Lake. I think I rode my bike over there and delivered the stuff. And so the next morning he came in, and the gal said he just took my material, read it. He said, "This is my statement. Send this out to all the wire services." So when I got up the next morning, opened the paper, here's all this stuff I just turned in, right? And it was picked up all over the place, and it was even used in the introduction to Bob, guy wrote a book on Hollywood. I'll think of the name in a minute. Get to a certain age, and names just too. Bob, he used it as Bob Hope's introduction to the one and only Bing. He wrote a book called The One and Only Bing. And so I'd been on the staff for so little time that this was a terrific thing for me to see how this happened. And then I had great confidence that I could do a good job for him and know that I could have a job for as long as I wanted it. All things, luck holding, you know. But I was right. It turned out to be a long job for me, which in Hollywood is, you know, year after year you keep getting re-signed. It's a great thing on any job that you like.
Sure, many jobs for writers can go in lengths of weeks or even days, and many
Yeah.
other aspects of
Minutes.
those in media.
Yeah.
You say in your book your contract with Hope was a 40-week contract with a separate contract to write for the stage in the summer. So you're writing not only for broadcast but also for his live appearances. Give us a sense of how that contract worked and what the week-to-week life of writing for
Well,
Bob Hope was like.
Bob Hope was a complex guy, but he was very naive in many ways and childlike. He had been told years ago by a baseball team owner, said, "Bob, if you're smart, you'll never hire people on a long-term contract. I have to do that to get these players. And then if they don't play well, I'm stuck with paying them what I agreed to pay. If I get sick, I've got to pay them. It just doesn't pay. Just hire writers for the season." So he does. That's his rule. He's going to hire not a long, well, any one of us would have signed a long-term contract. We all had good agents, or most of us. A couple of guys didn't. But in Hollywood, you get a long-term contract for 4 or 5 years. You sign that, and he gets a good deal because you make some concessions to get that contract. But he didn't do that. So every year my agent would renegotiate my contract. And my father used to come down and visit, and the phone would ring, and I'd say, "Oh, it's probably my agent telling me whether I have a job or not." And my father would turn pale, whether you have a job or not. "Oh, yeah, well, it's just a formality. What we're talking about is how much I'm going to make this coming season." And that's the way it was. We had no long-term contracts, but it worked out fine because I had an agent named Bernie Weintraub, one of the best in town, Gene's agent too, by the way, and he recommended me. Everything I got, I was recommended by Gene Barrett. Anyway, he recommends me to him, and so I had him for years. Never met him either. Talk about not meeting Dean. I never met my agent, ever. To this day, I've never met. I don't even know if he's still alive, but he. His nickname was the Claw, and he did a very good agenting. So the only time I'd ever talk to him was by phone, and he'd call me and tell me when the starting date was, And my checks would go to Robinson Weintraub, and then they would take their 10% and issue a check to me. So that's the way it worked. So if I ever met his receptionist, I was going to say, I put your daughter through Bryn Mawr. Probably did over the years. Anyway, that's how that worked.
You say in your book, when you signed on with Bob Hope, it was akin to entering an ancient religious order. A contract to write for him was considered gilt-edged.
Well, yeah, it was a good job in this town in those days because of the permanency of it. You knew you couldn't get fired. Larry Gelbart became a great writer, MASH and all those things, but not when he was with Hope. He was hired as a young guy with Hope, and he said, you had to quit Hope. He would never fire anybody. You had to quit. And so Larry Gelbart moved on, but by this time, I'm an old guy, and I'm going to stick with him as long as he's doing this. And so that's the way it worked. It was a club like these names, because they'd all been with him for so long. If you don't fire people, you have people for a long time. And some of them have been with him for 30, 35 years. Can you imagine? He had a guy named Norman Sullivan. Used to bring in material, and I'd see him, he was in his 80s, and lived on a yacht or a boat down at Malibu. And he'd drive in with this material, and I asked the gal, who is this guy I see all the time? Oh, that's Norman Sullivan. Really? Because I remembered his credits from the show. But he for years and years, and was still working as a stringer, working monologues and things when he was way up. But he never had any other job. He hired on with Hope as a kid. I think he worked for Hope for 40 years or so. Barney McNulty is cue card guy, 37 years, something like that. It was a family affair, and you got very close to these people because you're working with the same people year in and year out. And that was the fun of it. And he always chose people that were alike. They were like him. They were up people, and had no negative people. That he didn't have anybody who was moody, for instance, or odd. He just enjoyed having fun, and he liked to be around people who were like that and enthusiastic about what they were doing and life in general. And that's the kind of people that you work with. And, what's better than that, right? So it was fun. But
It's one thing to say that Hope never fired anyone, and obviously he had many long-term writers, but he did fire Mort Lockman. We've talked about
well,
this.
that wasn't him, actually. That was Texaco and NBC. 1970, one of the reasons I got the job at the time that I did on the show, because he'd had these writers for years, and Gene wasn't working on the show for that reason. Gene was on the Burnett show because the Bob Hope show was filled up with the same writers who had been with him for a long time. And Texaco and NBC got together, and they wanted to re-sign Hope for a long-term contract, and they did re-sign him, which was the largest contract at the time. I think $7 million, something like that, for 5 years or whatever it was. But the condition was, your shows are getting cookie-cutter-like, and they all look alike, which they, by this time, were looking alike. And so they said, we want you to travel, and we want every show to have a different producer. Well, goodbye Mort Lockman, because Mort had been his producer for a long time and head writer. So that was Mort. And also, we want new writers. And so you'll hire these other producers, which will add a different kind of feel to the show, and the fact that you're going to do shows on the road will get it out of Hollywood and the usual stuff that you've been doing. And for this, we'll give you $7 million. Unless you don't want to do that, we'll walk away. So Hope turns to Elliot and says, do you want to tell him or shall I? Okay, you can imagine what that was like. Someone had to tell these guys that, it was going to change. So they did. Elliot Kozak, sweet guy, passed on a couple of years back. But He had to tell them, and it was tough for a lot of them who had been with Hope for so long. So they get together to start the first show. I think it was 1976-77 season. I started 77-78 season. 76-77 season, they start the first show. And Bob says to Elliot, with these new writers that are being brought in, how are we going to have anybody tell them how we do the show? Don't we need somebody that's familiar with the way I work? And Elliot says, yeah, but the only people who know that are the guys we just let go. So he says, well, you think maybe if we snuck a couple of them back, they'd care or find out? He said, I don't know. It's worth a try. Who should I call back? Now, somebody's going to get a call and say, hey, we were a little premature. You do still have a job. So Hope looks at him and says, who doesn't have an agent? Okay? So when I went to work on the show, the two old-timers were Gig Henry and Charlie Lee, who had been around for a long time, and me. And Charlie Lee, his health was failing, so it was primarily Gig and me for 3 or 4 or 5 years. In fact, when we went to China in '79, Gig and I wrote the entire show with Jim Lipton, who is now the host of, Live at the Actors Studio. And he produced some of the best Bob Hope specials on the road. We did 3 shows, 1980, 81, 82 at Air Force Academy, West Point, and Annapolis. And those really hold up. I do, cruise ship shows and stuff, and for senior centers, and I show a lot of clips from those shows because the material and the were so well done. But here we did a 3-hour special in China, and Gig and I are writing all the stuff, and Hope, in his wisdom, makes a deal with King Feature Syndicate to write a column every 3 or 4 days, my impressions of China. And they're going to run this in King Feature's syndicated column in papers all over the country. And then he makes a deal with Saturday Evening Post. They're going to combine these into a big article at the end, which they did at the end of our trip. So every couple of days, Hope would say to Gig and me, we were working on something else, right? He'd say, isn't it about time I had some more impressions of China? I'm going to take my nap now, and when I get finished, I'm sure I'll have plenty of impressions. Oh, you will, Bob, you will. And so we'd sit there and say, what do you think? And we would kick around ideas. Well, we'll talk about fashion. Maybe, the fashions are changing here in China from gray to black and white. Or, there was no color there at the time. I mean, it was just very, very much like it had been for centuries. And that's what made the trip so darn interesting. But Gig and I would write these things, and then he said, oh, wait, I have to send them to King Features in Tokyo by teletype. See if they have a teletype here. So we're in the Peking Hotel, and you have a teletype, so we have an interpreter, Project, oh, yeah, down in the basement. Go down in the basement. They have a teletype machine that had been there, since the Boer War, I think. It was like a big cast iron thing, and Gig and I had never worked it before, so we're experimenting, and finally you made a tape, and you clicked the thing out. You know how teletype works, and then you stick the tape, because once the tape is going, then you're being charged for between China and Japan. So you make sure the tape is right. So we learned how to work an old-fashioned teletype. We're not only writing the thing, we're sending it. And having a ball doing it. Gig was a sweetheart. And an older guy took me under his wing, too, and it was just fun working with him for a few seasons. And then as time went on, we added a few more people. But it never was more than like 5 people writing the specials, the TV specials. Yeah, great days.
You said that Hope had a 40-week contract with you for television and the other for summer stage shows. Hope, as we know, long-standing contract or contracts with NBC. He was with NBC his whole life. How many specials was he producing in a year's time?
When I went with
generally
him,
speaking?
when I went with, he was doing about 8 or 9. We would do a show every other month, and then gradually, and it stayed that way for quite a while. Then we would do fewer shows but longer ones. I mean, we did a 6-hour retrospective in about 1983, I think, 83 or 84, produced by Andrew Salt. Oh, that's another great thing. I'm working with different producers each time, so I've worked with the greatest producers in Hollywood. I work with, the first producer that I worked with was the co-writer of Casablanca and the president of Paramount Pictures. Forget his name, but he's very big. Anyway, that was the fun because every producer had a different idea of. Work with Don Ohlmeyer. We did a tribute to the 75th anniversary of the World Series. Work with Jane Upton Bell, the daughter of Burt Bell, one of the early commissioners of the NFL, owner of the Philadelphia Eagles, and got all kinds of things working with her. I mean, we used to go to Georgia Frontier's private box to watch the Rams. You ever been to the owner's private box? Ooh, heady experience. Every person is famous there. You look around, you say, what am I doing here? I'm the only civilian. Famous people, all kinds of food, and they had a chef there who was making anything you wanted. We used to fly around on a general's plane, had a chef on it. Can you imagine? And if we would go to on these military junkets with a plane owned or used by General Dwayne Cassidy. Dwayne Cassidy had flown Bob Hope around during World War II. They were great friends, and so he said, anytime you need to move people or anything, you let me know and my plane will do it. So what was the question? Oh, what's that question again?
Okay, picking back up, Bob, talking about the specials. Your first special on which you worked for Bob Hope was On the Road with Bing. Now, this is an important time to come into the picture because this special relates to Bing Crosby and his long association with Bob Hope. And I guess this was on the heels of Crosby's death, is that correct?
Yeah, and he had died in August, so we were shooting this thing in like September. And it was like a month later. And we had been waiting for Bing to come back home to be on the first special called On the Road with Bing. And it was going to be the two of them would reminisce with Dorothy Lamour and talk about working in the road pictures. So I was very excited because I had never met Bing and was looking forward to it. So that was dashed, but they decided to do the show without Bing, pretty much the same way they would have done it with him, with clips and a lot of reminiscing about what it was doing the road pictures. And Hope had a lot of great stories about the road pictures too. So it was a good special to start with, and we were off and running with our first non-Hope producer, by the name of co-writer of Casablanca and later president of Paramount Pictures, and I can't think of his name.
We should have stopped and Googled that.
Yes.
But that's okay since that doesn't relate specifically to your story. You said that Hope was doing as many as 8 specials a year in those early days.
Yeah.
Give us a sense of the week-to-week working life of a Bob Hope writer in those days when he was doing a special every other month at least.
Well, we would be doing the specials, plus he would be on the road doing personal appearances. So certain of us were hired to do both. Jean was one, I was another, and we would be doing that simultaneously with putting the show together. And a lot of times we would start rehearsing the show before Hope had come back from doing personal appearances. And some funny things used to happen. One time he was going to do Small Fry at a Christmas special with, remember that song? with
Johnny Mercer's song.
Yeah,
Oh, well,
Andy
it was a big hit
Williams.
for Andy Williams.
Andy Williams was going to do Small Fry with Hope because Hope had done it with Bing Crosby, and it's a cute song. Small Fry, da 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 dee dee small, and then there'd be a stop, and then you do jokes, you know. G Daddy, you know, Hope is dressed as Little Lord Fauntleroy, and so the first stop, he says, G Daddy, why am I an only child? And Andy says, for the same reason nobody ever bought two Edsels. So we're rehearsing this without Hope or without Andy. And Hope is there. So Hope says, you're about Andy's size, and they'll light you and everything. So you play Andy. And so, oh, this is fun. So I'm reading the cue cards, and we're doing the jokes, you know. And so then finally, a couple of days later, we're shooting another segment, and Andy shows up. They're going to use the real Andy. So I go running up to him, and I said, oh, you're going to love this. I played you. And he said, how did you do? And I said, oh, it was wonderful. He said, well, why don't they just use you? And he wasn't kidding. I mean, he was kind of like to play golf, too. But I ended up doing work for Andy after I was off the Hope specials, and he wasn't doing specials anymore. Andy used to do Christmas specials, and he owned a theater in Branson. So I liked Andy. I miss him. But you never do what Hope would ask you to do. I mean, you could have so much fun wondering what you would be doing next. One time he said to us, Gig and I were sitting on some show, and he said, hey, what are you guys doing tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock? Oh, nothing special. Why don't you go over to my house? I want you to be interviewed by a friend of mine who has a radio show out of Miami, and he's really a nice guy, and I'm going to be busy, but I told him that he could ask you questions about working for me, and it'll be fun. And I said, okay, what's his name? Larry King. Larry King. Never heard of Larry King. He was in radio, but Hope knew him for years.
He was in local radio in those days.
That's right. Yeah. And the reason, he had a late night show nationwide, and that's when he first started to become known. Over
Mutual.
Yeah, and he liked Hope because he could always call him if a famous big interview fell out, and you have to get somebody equally famous. So if he was scheduled to do Sinatra and Sinatra couldn't do the interview, he'd call Hope, and Hope would sit in. So they became fast friends that way, and until Hope died. In fact, I talked to Larry at Hope's memorial. They were very close. So Gig and I went over, and he's all set up there, and he looked like maybe a cab driver, insurance salesman or something. He had a white shirt, and I remember he had the sleeves rolled up and the suspenders, you know, and these big glasses, and he had that accent, you know, and he said, how are you guys? You know, sit down, and here, I got the thing, and he starts talking to us, and we're talking for a while, and he's asking questions. So we're set up in Bob Hope's gatehouse outside the big house over in Toluca Lake. And so Bob was going to come and be for the last 5 minutes or something like that. And so I said, when do we actually get started with the interview? And he says, oh, we've been on the air for a half hour. I said, really? Yeah. He had some kind of a thing tapped into the telephone. I don't remember the microphones being prominent. They were there, obviously. They were picking up what we were saying. But I thought, oh, I didn't know I was on the radio. I wonder what I said, right? But things like that could happen. You never knew, working for Bob, what exciting thing would happen next or who you would meet, because he treated everybody alike. And I think that's why people liked him so much. Famous people liked him because they knew he treated them like a normal human being. One day I was working in Texas. I'll never forget this. And I'm working in Hope's Suite, and we've got the show all laid out with cards and everything, and how we're going to order the acts. And So somebody came in and he said, "Oh, Jerry, good to see you. Come on over. I want to introduce you to somebody." So I'm working there, and this guy's to my back, and he says, "You know Jerry, don't you? You've met Jerry." And I thought he was talking about one of the cue card guys, and I said, "Oh, yeah, yeah, Jerry." And I turn around, and it's Gerald Ford. And he comes over. "Oh, no, I've never met this Jerry. How are you, Jerry?" Don't lean forward. So, what do you say, you know? I said, "Oh, good to meet you, Jerry. You boys are doing a very fine job for Bob Hope. You make him funny, and that's, Betty and I just get so much laughs out of this show. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you like it." So he treated you like an equal, like you were on their same level, and you aren't, you know. No matter how you think about it, we're just not. And but it didn't matter to him. We were just like anybody else, and so was everybody else. And so you never know who you'd meet next. So we met met Reagan that way, and oh gosh, oh, and the sports people loved him. So I met an awful lot of football players and boxers. He loved boxing because he had been a boxer as a youth, and so we had a lot of boxers on the show. You were asking me a particular show that I like.
I was asking you, or about to ask you about, and was leading toward asking you about the working life of a writer for Bob Hope. What hours, what days per week did you work? What hours did you work? What was the working day like?
We were on duty all the time, and he would call for his stage act whenever he needed something. And so that was the job. And you worked at home, and never called at night because I told him I don't work nights, and he respected that. So, but during the day, you know, you could get 4 or 5 calls sometimes. But one time I tell the story in my show I do. When he was in the East, when he would go on stage at 9 o'clock, 6 o'clock our time, we would figure we're off the hook because he's on stage and he can't call us anymore. So I was barbecuing, had some people here, and so I'm starting to heat up the coals, and about 10 after 6 a phone rings, and Shell says, "Mr. Hope." "Oh, God, 10 after 6. What? So I come in, I get the phone, I said, "Bob, what's the deal? Aren't you on stage?" He said, "I'm about to go on," and I can hear in the background the band playing his medley of hits from his movies, you know, Buttons and Bows and all that. And I said, "What do you need?" He says, "I need an opening line." When I landed, I didn't know that they're doing a lot of installing pipes, and it's all dug up. This whole town is dug up, and I have to say something about it. And I'd like to say it right at the beginning. I said, "How much time do I have?" He said, "About 30 seconds. I said, "Hold on." So I covered the phone, and I thought real hard, came back in about 5 seconds and said, "I love this town. Great to be back here. I've never been in downtown Beirut before." He said, "Just between here and the hotel, the cabbie and I exchanged teeth 5 times." He says, "That's it," and hangs up. So I came from the phone, walked out. I said, "Folks, I just earned my entire salary for 1982 or whatever it was." But that's what you were hired to do, to be available on short notice when he needed you, and he could rely on you coming up with something. Not going to always be earth-shaking, but it'll be something, and it'll be consistent, and that's what. And you knew that you could be called upon at any time, an emergency like that. But ordinarily, he made sure that we had plenty of time, and he would call and he'd say, "Let's do some things on this, this, and this," or whatever was in the news that day, and then I would call the other writers. Then they would dictate what they had written, and I would collect it all. Then he'd say, "I'll call you back when I get into Miami," or whatever it was. And he would call right on time, and you would read the jokes to him, and he would check off the ones he wanted. And he's writing them down, see? Like Lincoln writing the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope in a hotel someplace. Very rudimentary. So when fax machines came into vogue, oh, it just saved us. Because hotels were the first businesses to install fax machines. And so we went out and got them very early on when they were still very expensive. In fact, I still use the one. I got a Panasonic 150, and it still works well. And rolled paper, they don't even make rolled paper. I don't know where I get it anymore. But it made life so much easier because you could then fax the material to his hotel and he would be there. When we did it the first time, he couldn't believe it. It was like, he says to me, "How does this work?" And I said, "Bob, I'm not really sure, but just sit back and enjoy it." I said, "Where are you? Boston, right?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "How'd you get there?" He said, "I flew." I said, "No, you didn't." I said, "What do you mean?" "Oh, you got into an aluminum tube in Miami, and the aluminum tube curled you through the air and landed in Boston." "How did that happen?" "Well, I don't know, really." I said, "Faxing is the same way. Just take advantage of it and don't ask questions."
You described,
Excuse me, Hal Wallace.
Oh, the producer? No.
oh, Hal Wallace, the producer of, you're saying, of
The
Casablanca?
two that did it was Jack Warner and Hal Wallace. Jack Warner didn't work at Paramount.
You got the writers of Casablanca?
No, the
Plus,
said
by
producer.
the way, Casablanca's not a Paramount movie, but it's at Warner
No,
Brothers.
he
Yeah.
became president of Paramount later.
Oh, he was a writer?
Yeah, he was a writer at the time.
Okay.
Well, picking back up on this topic, when you described your process of writing for the stage, you described you calling the other men, they doing their work, and then you would liaise between them and Hope. And also, I note that when you had this emergency, or Hope had this emergency on stage in the East, needed a joke, he called you, he didn't call the other writers. What was your position in this chain, that you were the person with whom he spoke in a pinch, and you were the person with whom the others liaised when...
Well, I happened to be the one that was around the most often then. It was kind of like, I think Jean was busy over at Carol Burnett at the time, and we had another couple of writers, but they were newer. We had a gal that signed up for the show, and then we had a writer who slept during the day and wrote at night. He was a wonderful guy, but so he wouldn't be available because he'd still be asleep. So that probably was the reason, you know. But could have been somebody else if he had thought of it.
But it sounds as though when you were given an assignment by Hope, so long as you did your work, he didn't specifically care what time of day you did it, when you did it, if you worked at night and slept during
Correct.
the day.
Yeah.
You talked about, in doing the stage shows with Hope, you explained a very interesting process by which he prepared those monologues for the stage. A man named Ward Grant, you say, sent questionnaires to each venue, and those questionnaires were used to form local material for each local stage show. Can you talk about the process of writing for the
Yeah,
stage
he
shows?
discovered this process during the war, World War II, when he was doing the USO shows. Since he was a topical monologist, he didn't have story-type jokes like, say, George Burns had. So going from base to base, he realized if he had some information about each base in advance, he could do inside stuff and it would be so personal to these guys. If he knew, for instance, the name of some floozy in town that everybody, you know, had dated, you know, services. But that kind of thing. Any inside information is helpful because then the writers can do a joke just for that crowd. It's not going to appeal to anybody else or be understood by anybody else. Realizing this, he started sending questionnaires ahead. If he was going to be at Subic Bay, they would get, and the service was more than happy to do this because they're all in contact with one another, and you can get messages out there. So he would get info, and then and the writers loved it because they had topics to deal with. You can only do so many bad food jokes or gambling in the barracks jokes, but when you can do jokes that have some meat to them, all the better. And Hope realized that the closer, the more personal his material was, the closer the audience felt to him, and the more successful he was. And it carried over to his act at home, too. Why not? He would always have a few opening jokes, even when he was doing his act, which he had perfected over years and years. He had a set act. He could go for like 2 hours from memory with all different sections of the country and terrific monologists. I always tell people, if you didn't see Bob Hope on stage, you didn't really see him. TV was just a medium to remind the audience that he was doing his stage show, that he was a vaudevillian, and at heart, that's what he loved, see? And so he would begin every single monologue with 2 or 3 localized lines, like that one I just told you about, downtown Beirut, because he had to know in advance that the street was torn up. The audience knows he took the trouble to find out that, and took the trouble to say something about their little problem. And it was a sure winner when it came to ingratiating yourself to audiences, and they loved him for it, you know. He would slide into his ordinary material that he had done, but you never saw that seam where it left, and then he always made people feel like they were special. In fact, I watched him do this over and over again. He had a piano player named Jeff Clarkson. I'm sorry, a piano player named Jeff Clarkson. And he would say something like, he'd say, you know, I love Boston. I was here last time, and I couldn't wait to get back. And, oh, I got to tell you a story I just heard today, just today. Hold it. Jeff would be playing cue songs, you know. We're going to do a little buttons and bows for you. Dun, 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 dun. No, hold it, Jeff. I got to tell him this story. I just heard this story today. Bing, bing, bing. Be a story he's been, you know, using in his act for 35 years. And then he'd say, okay, Jeff, bum, bum, bada, bum. Here's a little buttons and bows for you. Doodly-dee, dee. No, wait a minute. I just thought of something. He's reeling them in. See, now they're thinking, wow, we're so special. He keeps thinking of these new jokes that he just heard. I mean, brilliant salesmanship, isn't it? I mean, just brilliant. And he would just reel them in, and I'm thinking, oh, brother, they didn't see it. They had no idea that he hadn't just heard that this afternoon, and I got to tell these folks. The greatest salesman ever lived, and I say that. I never saw anybody who was able to sell a product like he sold Bob Hope for all those years. Wow. I used to watch him.
Well, you worked on many specials for Hope, and too many to discuss all of them, obviously. But let's just talk about a stereotypical special. You say in your book that Hope had autonomy on scheduling the specials with NBC, his longtime network. So the specials would go on wherever Hope wanted them to go on, apparently. Just picking any special that you would think of in your mind, can you talk us through a special from start to finish, the production, the taping, more or less how it would go?
Oh, God. We pretty much a set routine, you know. We would have one meeting at the beginning. Everybody hated meetings, including Hope, because we were writers, and writers hate to discuss things and talk. You want to just get to it, but you have to know what you're going to get to. So we'd have meetings, say, okay, we're going to do a special on a tribute to the Palace Theater. Let's do some monologue jokes on this, and we have some topics. Let's do a sketch about this, and then come up with different ideas and run them by Hope, and he would okay them or not. And then once we settled on an idea, the outline, which was written up to suggest the idea in the first place, would go to all the writers, including the one who submitted it, and he would use that as a guide to write the sketch or whatever. The monologue, we always waited. It was the taped last, so we would wait until 2 or 3 days before the show was to air, and then we would submit to him about 15 or 20 topics, out of which he would pick 10 or 12, and then we would get to work and write maybe 10 to 20 lines on each topic. So he would have tons of material to get that 35 jokes that consisted of the opening monologue, ran 6 minutes, more or less 35 jokes. He might start with 2,000 jokes. And that is a lot of winnowing down and a lot of possibilities to get the best of the best. And even then, after he would tape the monologue, he would get into the control room, watch himself delivering the lines, and reorder lines or take lines out or fix anything. The gal would be taking the notes, you know. So his monologue was his most important part of any show. And he, his rule was that if you hooked them with the monologue, they would not tune away. And he was right. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember I would love the monologue the best because it was topical and hard-hitting stuff, see, for the time. And then you were then 6 or 8 minutes into the show, and, well, you'd stick with it, and, you know, you'd be hooked. So that's why he considered the monologue so important, and it was, and he put a lot of effort into it. And it shows, I think, a lot of his monologues you look at today, and they hold up pretty darn well. Carson used a lot of the same Hope-type tricks, doing his monologue that same way. In fact, used Hope writers. He would hire Hope writers that were retired to write for him, because Charlie Lee, for one, went over and wrote for him, and they were doing pretty much the same type of humor in those days. But Hope had such power at NBC that he could pick the time that his show would air. So we'd be sitting in the room, and he'd say, "When do you think we should air this thing?" "Well, let's see. Saturday, there's a golf tournament, maybe. Sunday," and we'd weigh different. And then, okay, how about Saturday, 7 to 9? Okay. And he'd get on the phone and call the president of NBC and tell him when the Bob Hope Show was going to air. Not even Seinfeld, at his most powerful, ever had that much power. And he was powerful later on, but Bob Hope could do that, and he could do something else that really infuriated Johnny Carson, because when he was going to promote a show that would be on a certain weekend, the Friday before that airing, he would go on Carson, no matter who the other guests were, and Carson just had to adapt to have Hope there. And he really, and you could see it too. I mean, we would watch Hope on Carson, and you could see Carson just, you know, resenting the fact that Hope was using Tonight Show as a billboard for his show, but he'd have to go along with it, and did. But and guested on several of our shows, so they were friends. But there was always that little. They were both kind of big. Who's the king of NBC, right? Carson or Hope? Yeah. Both had their big portraits on the side of the building, if that tells you anything.
Well, let me ask you 2 last questions about the specials, then we'll just bring the general interview to a close with some last thoughts about Hope. One of these is about Carson. Hope would use the Carson audience to tape his monologues. He would, as you've described in past interviews, he would save the taping of the monologue as long as possible, as close to the air date as possible, to make it as current as possible. And when it came time to tape that, he would use Carson's audience, holding them over after the Carson taping to tape his monologue. And as I'm given to understand from those who were there, he would announce it as kind of a surprise, as if it was just an impromptu last-minute thing.
Yeah.
It has been said that Johnny and you touched on this just a little bit, honestly resented the use of his audience, maybe on some level, as much as you had to respect Hope as the king of NBC, maybe on some level resented Hope in general. What was your, and you talked about it just a little, what was your overall sense of their relationship when you were around the set there?
Well, I don't think he cared about us using his audience after his show was over, because what harm is there to that? These are tourists in town for the night, and it was the using of the show as the billboard that I don't think Johnny liked very much. But Johnny was a strange guy. He was very shy. I think it's hard to believe. In fact, I say in my book, the shyest entertainer I ever met, really. And he was shy around his own staff members. I knew all the writers on the show, and every year he'd have a Christmas party, staff party, and he would come, and he would walk around and just shake each hand, and you could tell he was stiff and uncomfortable, as Richard Nixon would be at such a party. And then he would leave and get out of there. He had no, in fact, he said he hated parties, and even, mixing with his own kind, he wasn't relaxed, and they could tell he didn't like it, and so they wouldn't dwell on it, but they would say, and he was nice to them. But I was sent over by Bob Hope. He did a show one time called Hope for President, and Carson had agreed to do a spot where he is going to be his publicist and talk about Hope's early life and his entry into politics. And of course, someone had to write this, so Hope had me write up some things about using scenes from pictures that he had made, and then make up some stories to go with each picture. And he had an easel. Carson would have an easel and say, when he was 19 years old, to work for whatever, and joke, like that. So he said, go over and make sure that Carson's comfortable with all this stuff. And because we had sent the script over, but he hadn't seen exactly how the easel would work and everything. Take the easel with you, and the pictures that we chose, he hadn't seen the pictures, and make sure that he's comfortable with this, which is a nice thing to do, So I went over, and I remember I waited, and the gal said, he'll be right in. So he comes in, and he was very tense, and I thought, God, I hope he okays all this stuff. Well, it turned out it was fine, He just was tense because he didn't know me. He was, even though he knew I wrote for Bob Hope and I was of his own species, he didn't know, he didn't meet me before, and he knew me from watching the monologue. We would stand there and up against the wall with the other Carson writers and watch his monologue. So he was just a strange duck that way. And everybody talked about how shy he was and his whole life. And it was just odd that, and he would tell interviewers that the only time he was comfortable is when he came out and he was in charge of that room and he was on stage telling jokes, then it was fine. But in a social situation or any kind of a unfamiliar thing like that, and it just struck me odd, that somebody that good at what he did could be that shy, but he was shy.
You worked on, my research, if I have it correct, 85 specials between 1978 and 1992. Again, so many specials. Are there any specials? Is there any special that you would like to mention? Any particular one that comes to mind as a favorite, or one about which you have interesting anecdotes that you would like to mention?
Well, we did one that I think was close to Hope's heart. He loved vaudeville anyway, and we did a tribute to the Palace Theater, which was the icon of all vaudevillians to appear there. And we had a lot of big stars on the show, including Carol Lawrence was on it, doing excerpts from Mame and Funny Girl, and Hope played, Florence Ziegfeld, and it was a classy show, and it was written, or it was produced by Shelley Keller. Shelley Keller was a very interesting guy who produced 6 or 8 very, very strong Hope specials. He had been a writer for Sid Caesar, and in that group, that show of shows group, and then Caesar's Hour went over and after the show of shows, and he was the head writer on that, and I think he produced it too. And he helped start the Beverly Hills Unlisted Jazz Band, played the bass. And then we used to go to his house every Christmas. Kind of took us under his wing because I was kind of new to the business. This was very early on too. And he was just a very nice guy. And his son, I'm still in touch with his son. Shelley died several years back of Alzheimer's, but Casey Keller is now in television and doing things. And he produced it, and he had a great love for vaudeville and all things vaudevillian, and knew a lot about it. And we did a routine with George Burns and Hope called That's the Way It Was in Vaudeville. And it was a typical vaudevillian type song where you would sing to the middle part, and then they would stop, do jokes, and then finish the song.
What they would have called fast patter.
Yeah, and it was terrific, and it was very well done. We had converted the NBC studio into the Palace Theater, so it looked like the Palace Theater. And we had a special audience came in. And George Burns had been on the road, and Hope had been on the road, and they were set to rehearse, and we had sent tapes. That's the way it worked. You would have the music arranger, Bob Alberti, would make tapes of whatever you were going to sing, and you would have someone else singing, and so you match that so that you could hear. It was a special lyric song called That's the Way It Was in Vaudeville. And so they had heard the tapes and gone over the tapes, but they hadn't rehearsed it as such together. So we had finished some other segment, and we had the audience in this vaudeville setting there in the Palace Theater, fake Palace Theater. So they said, let's try it anyway, and we'll do it in front of the audience, and we'll get the reaction. They always like to get the audience reaction anyway. And so they start. Well, it was complex because it had dance moves, lyrics, and the joke part at the beginning was the easiest part. They could read the cue cards for that. But for the music part and the dancing part, well, they got started. And in the middle of all this chaos, they would get into like half a bar, and one of them would make a mistake or the other one would make a mistake. They had canes and a hat. In fact, it starts hat, cane, trunk, plane. That's the way it was in vaudeville. Da-da-da-da-da, dun, dun, dun. And they're dressed in little vaudeville-type travel suits, spats, and they're in a train station. And it was really a nice-looking number. So, and the audience is just laughing at these mistakes. So after about 10 minutes, they can't get further into hat, cane, trunk, train. That's the way it was in vaudeville. One of them make a mistake. Hold it. And they start over again. They must have started over again before we got it all on tape 100 times. Oh, and now, Hope commented at the beginning. He says, you're going to see about an hour of that to the audience. And he wasn't kidding. They ended up seeing about an hour and a half of that to get 6 minutes on the screen. Oh, it was just a riot. And Shelley Keller was smart enough to say to the director, keep the tape running when these guys are talking, because they got to reminiscing about vaudeville in between, and it's a classic piece of tape. And so I have it, and I show it every once in a while to guests and stuff. And that was one of the most interesting shows we did, and I think Hope considered it one of the best he did too, because he was proud of having come from vaudeville and everything vaudeville was of interest to him. But that one, and we did a lot of good sports specials too. We did a tribute to the 75th anniversary of the World Series, produced by Don Ohlmeyer, who went on to become president of NBC. We did stand up and cheer for the NFL's 50th year, 60th year. It was 60 years old, I think, in 1980 something. And that was produced by Jane Upton Bell, who was daughter of Bert Bell, one of the early commissioners. And for that one, we got Liz Taylor to play the female commissioner. The producer, Jane Upton Bell, had always had the idea she wanted to do a sketch about the first female commissioner, and since we had Liz Taylor, she thought that'd be perfect for her. So hope goes to Liz, and Liz didn't do a lot of television, as you know, but Hope used to appear at her AIDS benefit at Wolf Trap in exchange for a favor. And so the favor was, come on our show and play the first female commissioner of the NFL. So she was trapped. She had to do it. She was wolf trapped. So anyway, so we do the show, and Liz, he pays her standard, I think it was $10,000 for this big star. Usually you had to pay more, see. So he says to Elliot, the manager, he said, let her keep the wardrobe. Whatever she wears, she can keep. So that'll help sweeten the deal a little bit, see. So after we do the show, they're going over the bills, and Hope sees something, says $750 for Tony Lama boots, snakeskin boots. So he says, what's this, Elliot? And said, oh, that was Liz's boots when she played the commissioner of the NFL, first commissioner, female. Says, boots? She spent the whole time standing behind her desk, talking to the players as they came through with complaints, right? We never saw any boots. Yeah, I know, but we told her she could keep the wardrobe, and she ordered them. So Hope says, Elliot, the next time we shell out $850 for boots, make sure the boys work them into the plot. Oh, God. Those were the days.
And before we go, Howard Koch.
Yes. Howard Koch, producer I ever worked with on a Bob Hope special.
Oh, we're back to, okay, Howard Koch, who
Co-wrote
wrote-
Casablanca?
but who also wrote War of the Worlds.
Yes.
Okay, thank you guys, wonderful, and a lot of other things. I mentioned this series of specials, 78 to 92. Are we okay, John?
Yeah.
Okay, 78 to 92. When you saw this era coming to a close, did you notice it coming to a close?
Yeah.
What were your observations? Did it come to a close simply because of Hope's age, or because of changes in?
No, it was Hope's age, because he stayed healthy for a long time, and then when he started to go downhill, when he like mid-80s, he fought it, and he shouldn't have done the last several seasons, and it was getting tough, because just to watch him trying to, he couldn't see the cue cards. Because he had a bad eye to start with, and he couldn't hear very well. And between the two of those problems, he would appear to be a little bit not with it, you know. And he mentally was fine, but physically he was starting to fail. And he really wasn't up to doing it, and shouldn't have been doing it. But I think one of the problems was he had been with NBC for so long. Who was going to say, Bob, I think, this should be your final season? And so nobody did. And every season, I'd be ready to hear the phone call, he's not going to do any more television. I knew he would keep doing personal appearances for as long as he could, but even there he was starting to slip. And you could see it coming for quite a while, and it was not fun to watch. It's not not a pleasant memory for me to look back. In fact, I have a chapter in the book called Waiting for Sharon Stone, and it's the final chapter about how that went. And it's very common, though. It's very hard to say when you hang it up. For sports people, the same way. They always stay a little bit too long, a little extra fight or two where they get beat up. And I remember thinking, this is like being in the corner of a fighter who's over the hill and, wiping off the blood and sending him back in there. There's something about it that doesn't set well. And I didn't have any fun on the last maybe 2 seasons for that reason. He stayed at least two seasons longer than he should have. And then even after he stopped doing any kind of regular television, they would do these so-called salute things. And one of them, they had to almost carry him out. And it was ironic because he had said to me one time, we wrote a thing for him. He was giving a medal to Omar Bradley, who a big general in World War II. And so he said, take a look, I'm giving the award to him at such and such a time, whatever it was. So I watched it on TV. And they kind of wheeled out Omar Bradley, who had had several strokes, and they had his old general uniform on, it didn't fit anymore. And he pinned the pin on him and said the words that we had written. So he calls after he gets back, and he said, what'd you think? And I said, it was fine. I think he was thrilled to get that award, whatever it was, And Hope said, I didn't think they were going to bring him out. I thought I was just going to do the speech and they would give him the award backstage. But they brought him out. And I said, yeah, but, he's alive and he's had a couple of physical problems, but he said, God, I hope that never happens to me. And I remembered that later, thinking, it's happening, it was like that. So that was a sad winding down of a terrific time that I had with the Bob Hope Show and with Bob Hope. And then after that, I worked on the book and then went out at sea, and we went on cruise ships talking about all this.
Let me ask you a couple of questions in concluding about your post-Hope career, but before I do that, what was you said that you knew after he stopped doing the specials he would still work on the stage. When did you formally end your association with Hope, and what was that like? How did that finally come?
Well, 92, he decided to not do any more television, so.
But you still wrote for the stage show, didn't you?
Yeah, as I recall, we did maybe write another 6 or 8 months or a year or something like that. But Jeffrey told me, Jeffrey the Clarkson, the piano player that I used in the other story, he had been on the road with him for years and years and had heard the act so often that he would just listen for his cue lines, and he would be thinking about other things. And one night, Hope came over to him and said, Jeffrey, have I done the Texas Aggie jokes yet? And he says to him, Bob, I haven't heard your act since 1976. So he says, well, start listening, will you? I'll have to ask the audience otherwise. So that's how it started. And then his hearing got so bad, he would start taking questions from the audience and couldn't hear, and just giving answers that made no sense. And then he would forget the act and come off stage soon, and he was collecting money for these. He did a lot of benefits, but he did a lot of paid dates too. And if a booker had a paid date and he's paying $85,000, which is the average that he got, to come in and do an hour and a half, you better do an hour and a half and not 40 minutes and leave. And he was starting to do that. And so there were lawsuit things, threatened and things. So finally, he was convinced to hang him up. But it must have been tough. I think he just fought tooth and nail to do it as long as he could. It was his whole life, you know.
One final question about Bob Hope, and this is a broad question that goes to the man more than the performer. Then books have been written entirely about Bob Hope as a person. But you say in your book, Bob Hope was something short of the hail fellow well met, but hardly the icy tycoon he appeared on screen. What is your thought about, considering his public image, about the private Bob Hope?
I think that when you really got to know him, you could see why he had a certain reputation. A lot of people thought he was cheap, for instance. And after I got to see him and observe, you know, how he operated, he wasn't cheap so much as he had gone through vaudeville during the Depression, and he's trying to break into a business as a new guy. And so he's not working a lot. Sometimes he didn't have much money, and he used to talk about making tomato soup out of ketchup at the automat, and then oyster crackers they used to put out for free, and that'd be dinner a lot of nights. So he never forgot vaudeville and what it felt like being poor. And I think it's common for people to retain that. If you've been through real, you know, close calls financially, you never forget it. And he never did, no matter how rich he got. So that it was ironic. I could see him peeling off a check for the Eisenhower Medical Center for $5 million, $10 million. That didn't mean anything to him because he never saw it. That's just talk. That's a word. But get $5 bill out of his wallet, now you're talking something. I have one story, and then we'll close, but it's a good laugh for you, that sums up Hope. And he had a writer on the staff called Bill Larkin, named Bill Larkin, and Bill was the only bachelor. So Hope calls him one day. He says, "How fast can you get to LAX?" And Larkin says, "Oh, about an hour. But why would I want to go to LAX?" "Well, if you meet me there, you'll get to go to Paris free, all expenses paid." "Really?" "Yeah." He says, "I got to make a negotiating thing. I'm negotiating by myself, and I'll have somebody to talk to. So if you want to go, pack, and I'll meet you at the gate." You know. So he does, packs, and so you always, when you get to Europe, you're always a little bit early, and they don't have your room quite ready, right? So they say, take a walk on the Champs-Élysées. So they're walking down the Champs-Élysées, and Larkin says to Hope, "Gee, you called me on such short notice, Bob. I didn't get a chance to stop by the currency exchange." And Hope says, "What do you need the currency exchange for? Your all expenses paid?" He says, "Well, you know, I feel better if I had a little walking around money in case I need a pack of cigarettes or something." Hope stops, pats him on the shoulder and says, "Bill, you know, you really ought to quit smoking," and keeps walking. When Bill told us that story, I thought it is so Bob Hope, because you could see the money in his pocket, but so he was generous in most big ways that count, but maybe a little short when it came to getting a $5 from him for a pack of cigarettes, which you shouldn't be buying in the first place. This has been a pleasure, Matthew, and I appreciate your asking me to do it.
Thank you for doing it, Bob. And in closing, last question. We're doing this, as you know, as a logical extension, I think, at least, of the work that Les Tremaine began many years ago for the PPB. When did the PPB come into your life, and what has it meant to you?
Well, it was Seaman Jacobs, prior recipient of the Diamond Circle Award, of which I will be getting on Friday, told me about it. I'd never heard of it, and he said, "You ought to come over. It's fun." So when I came the first time, here are people walking around that were my idols. I mean, there were still a lot of people alive then who I had listened to on the radio. I remember Ralph Edwards was one of them. We were sitting at a table one time, and Seaman said, "Oh, I'd like you to meet an old friend of mine, Jackie Kelk." Now, Jackie Kelk doesn't mean anything to anybody except if you were growing up listening to Henry Aldrich, Jackie Kelk played Homer. So I jumped up, I said, "Homer!" And he said, "You remember?" I said, "Of course." I mean, this was, centuries later, but he was very glad to hear that somebody still remembered Jackie Kelk. But Ezra Stone played Henry, and Jackie Kelk is Homer. You heard that every single episode. So there were all of these heroes of mine walking around at the time, and I was in seventh heaven. I still love going there. You've seen so many great recipients of being roasted there, big stars. I mean, and they were getting to the point they were doing them 2 and 3 times. They did Bob Hope at least once, maybe more than once. But it's a great club, and I think that they're trying to drum up new members, and I hope that they can. It really should go on, because there's a camaraderie among show folk that I don't think is common in any other business, really. People that work together, entertaining is a group effort to start with. So when you're working on something like the Hope Specials like I did, or a movie, for instance, it's a group effort. Everybody's effort is going into the end product that you're going to produce at the end. And you get very close to people doing that, especially over and over again, like the Hope Special. And in radio, they all knew one another because there were a bunch of them that appeared on all the different shows. And it was a small group, and they all had kept in touch. And you meet somebody like Parley Bear. I mean, when I met Parley Bear, I thought, God, the Keebler Cookie Man, And he went back to so many shows that I could think of way in the past. And here he is right there at the PPP. So I got a lot out of it and became a member. And now I'm going to be a Diamond Circle Award winner. My life is complete.
Robert L. Mills, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Matthew.